modelina, takie żółte, czerwone, niebieskie,
Dobra, okej, dobra.
takie kółeczka, albo prostokąciki, albo trójkąciki.
W jednym kolorze czy w kilku?
Wszystko jedno, nie ma żadnego znaczenia. Może być w jednym, byle
A ile tak
no jeżeli jest 20, ile tutaj jest osób? 25,
Dobra, to
tak?
30, żeby było.
25 razy 4 to setka myślę.
Setka, dobra. Dobrze,
Dobra? To w czasie przerwy.
dobrze.
Nie tej, tylko następnej.
Następnej.
Musisz się dowiedzieć w hotelu, gdzie to jest sklep papierniczy.
Wszystko dobrze.
Raz, raz, raz.
When do you need the list? After lunch?
After lunch.
So we can do it during lunch.
Okej, raz, raz, raz.
Ja? Oczywiście. Financial issues are run by
Okay, I think that we should restart our meeting. Sorry for being pushy, but the problem is that we'll have one Skype presentation and we must fit into the time necessary. Okay, so this is a legal session. I am an economist, so I should not run this session definitely. But I asked my colleague, Professor Dorota Pyć from my university, and she accepted to be a moderator of this session, and even she wanted to give a lecture. But unfortunately, 2 weeks ago, she was appointed as a Minister of Maritime Affairs in Poland. And she refused on a short note. You know, that would be a pity, because if she would become a minister in October, we would have a very nice session. But as a deputy minister, she has a lot of now tasks in Warsaw. So, therefore, I will try to substitute her. Fortunately, the legal part will be covered by Nico Nolte, who is a lawyer by the background. So you will have a possibility to see this from professional side. So Nico Nolte, he is one of the pioneers of the maritime spatial planning in the Baltic region, because he made himself, or under his supervision, they were some of the first plans. They were prepared, the German plans. He was responsible for the plan of exclusive economic zone himself. And this was a very challenging effort, because according to many lawyers, it was said that it is impossible to plan such a zone. But Nico did it. And we have such a plan now in the Baltic region. The only one is that plan, binding plan now in the region. So I would like Nico to present all those legal issues, especially law of the sea, but also some other, not only this global perspective, but also some Baltic perspective. So Nico will have half an hour. Please share with us your knowledge, and you will have some possibility to ask questions to Nico, but at 11 sharp we'll try to connect with Brussels, and Heitze Siemers will tell you about the EU perspective on maritime spatial planning. So Nico, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jacek. I hope the micro is on and you can understand me. Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much to Jacek for the friendly words in the beginning, and to Paula as well for the kind invitation to come over here and to give you some experiences from the German world of maritime spatial planning. My name is Nico Nolte. I'm working for the Federal Maritime and Hydrographic Agency in Hamburg. And I think I have seen some of you already in BoardSeaPlan events, and with some of you I have even worked together very intensely in the BoardSeaPlan and other MSP projects, so it's very nice to see you again. And thanks also for your very personal introduction. It helps me a lot to get the full picture, and I'm impressed about different backgrounds of you, your personal attitudes toward the sea, what you have done already when it comes to the sea, sea management, coastal zone management, and MSP. And I think this is a very good event to create a network on the issues. So just as a short background, our agency is responsible for nautical hydrography in the Baltic Sea and North Sea of German waters. So we are issuing the paper charts. We have own research vessels, hydrographic vessels, and we are doing as well physical and chemical monitoring of the condition of the sea. And in the Baltic Sea, our agency is running with a cooperation partner biological monitoring. And that's very important when you are tasked with the job of giving licenses for offshore wind farms or pipelines and cables, as it is the case with our division I'm the head of. So it's very good when you think about the sea that you have to work with other disciplines and job professions, and it's always good when you have as many of these people in your own agency, and we are working together with biologists, oceanographers, geologists, and that's very good when we think about management of the sea. Okay, I'm jumping in at short notice, and I give you some legal background, and please feel free to ask questions. I'm talking about general legal aspects. There are some of you who have already experience with international agreements, such as MINA with ESPO, so maybe we can join forces, and if there are questions to ESPO, then MINA, please help me out. Okay, this is just as an introduction. I'm deliberately showing you a slide from the North Sea, because it shows how crowded and packed the North Sea, or the sea in general, can be. And it shows you here the German exclusive economic zone with a lot of traditional uses and activities. Shipping and fisheries, of course, takes place everywhere, but especially in the traffic separation schemes you see here. And I've seen in some of your slides from Eva and Marta as well already traffic separation schemes, so maybe we can talk on that a bit later on as well. We have oil and gas industry in the sea. Just as an example, here is a gas platform. Oops. And we have a very small oil platform here. And if you compare it to our neighbors from the Netherlands and from Denmark, well, we are getting a bit envious, you know, that they have so many natural resources they can use. Sand and gravel extraction takes place, for instance, in this area. Pipelines are bringing gas from Norway to Germany, and we have nearly everywhere power and telecommunication cable, so very thin lines, you can hardly see them. We have an electricity cable passing the German exclusive economic zone coming from Norway to the Netherlands. Military training exercises are taking place either by the Navy or by the Air Force. We have scientific research, mainly for fishery questions. And we have, in the German exclusive economic zone, nature conservation sites. You see them here and in this area and in the Doggerbank, and they make up roughly 30% of the German exclusive economic zone. Here in the territorial sea, our colleagues from the states are responsible, Schleswig-Holstein and Lower Saxony, and the whole area is National Park Wadden Sea, and this is prolonged to Denmark and Netherlands, and this is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. We have a marine mammal protection site here and a lot of designations with the aim of nature conservation. And we see, and this is just to open your eyes, we see a lot of activities when it comes to offshore wind parks. We have already some wind farms in operation, this one here and that one here with roughly 100 turbines together. A lot of licensed wind farms who are now being built in the moment. 8 construction sites we have in the North Sea, and a lot of applications you can see here. That's because of our new energy policy, switching off nuclear power plants in the next years. And the hope is that the electricity can be produced by offshore wind farms, and we will see how this will be developing in the future. There are a lot of technical and physical challenges when you build a wind farm in 40-meter water depth. That's very challenging. But this is just an introduction, and I would like to talk with you on the different legal regimes. Can you help me out with some hints? Which legal regimes do you know? Because you have a multitude of uses. How do you deal with all these uses in legal terms? Maybe for you, you have a lot of questions towards what are the impacts on shipping, what are the impacts on marine environment. But do you have a clue on the legal regime? How you deal with that? Eva? Say it again, please. Okay. That's a very good point. In the exclusive economic zone, this is not part of the German territory. So there is no owner of the land. But this is a very good point, because in the territorial sea, in theory it's possible, but there the government is the owner, but you have to ask, at least in our country, for something like a lease. You have to go to the shipping administration, have to ask, I would like to use this area of the territorial sea, please, can we sign a contract? Yes, we are signing a lease contract. But that's just possible where the government is owner of the land. That's in the territorial sea, but not in the exclusive economic zone. But we come to that later. Other regimes, what do you think? Somebody comes to you, to your agency, and asks, I would like to do fisheries. I would like to build a wind farm, laying a pipeline. What do you think? Very good. Very good. Let's start with international law. Yeah, okay, let's go to EU law. Which EU law do you know which is relevant for the sea? Very good. Yeah. Natura 2000, that's exactly, do you know some of them? Can you give some names? Natura 2000 is correct. That's a coherent network. Yeah, we have the Birds Directive, we have the Fauna Flora Habitat Directive, we call it Habitat Directive, and there are of course others, but that are the most important. And so these EU directives are compulsory for every member state, and there is an obligation to designate Natura 2000 areas, to have to protect nature conservation sites. Further, you have to protect on species level, not just designating areas, but you have already the obligation to protect, let's say, marine mammals, which are listed in the annexes. So you have on the individual basis or population basis, you're obliged to protect. Okay, I think that's okay here. What about fisheries? Do we have a Polish fishery law, a Swedish fishing law? What do you think? Well, Anna? Yeah, the quota. Do we have how is it organized? Ever heard of common fishery policy? So the whole issue of fishery has been transferred to the European Commission, where we have a common fishery policy. So that's the rule. And then, of course, this is organized country by country, quota per quota. You have, let's say, fishing monitoring. You have, or let's call it fishing police, checking the quota. But there we have a good example of EU law, fisheries, nature conservation. What about shipping? IMO. How does it come? IMO. What is IMO? International Maritime Organization. We heard it. What is competence of IMO? Exactly. For instance, traffic rules, traffic separation schemes are mandatory ways ships have to take under certain conditions. We have seen them on some slides. This IMO is the only organization which is allowed to designate traffic separation schemes, but they can, being suggested by coastal states. Poland and Germany, for instance, suggested to IMO a traffic separation scheme south of Bornholm and went with this proposal to the IMO. So what is the other role of IMO? IMO is an international body dealing with shipping, and they have the right in all their different sections and committees to prepare legal documents. And the highest form of it are agreements for shipping. Do you know some agreements with regard to shipping? Ballast Water Convention, excellent. Excellent example. This is one of the 3-4 biggest threats to marine environment. Alien species brought from Asia to European ports. They are distributing and killing the natural fauna. Other agreements? Say it again, please. Yes. Facilitation, exactly. So we have a lot of agreements, and I'm naming just a few. Ever heard about SOLAS? Safety of life at sea. That was one of the oldest agreements, international agreements. Titanic accident 1912, and afterwards this agreement was being developed. There was an urgent need to say exactly lifeboats, how many lifeboats, what's the evacuation routines on board of huge ships. So this agreement is nearly 100 years old. Safety of life at sea, SOLAS. And then you have very technical agreements, for instance, load line agreements, dealing with what's the minimum distance between waterline and the upper ship board. And you have, meanwhile, of course, the need to protect marine environment against threats from shipping. We have maritime pollution agreement with a lot of annexes dealing how to deal with garbage, how to deal with oil, how to have an oil book on board, etc. So these are that's the international law, pure international law, and then country by country this is made domestic law. And for instance, you have all agencies in your country which are checking the oil record books, and if these are not in a proper state, then you can even fine. Okay. Yeah. Exactly. So UNCLOS, United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, is said to be the constitution of the sea. And I will come to that exactly now, because this is another example. So I want to show you there are different levels of legal regimes, EU, international, and of course domestic law. Yes, exactly. HELCOM for the Baltic Sea, OSPAR for the North Sea. Under this umbrella, agreements are made, and the member states then use them to protect the marine environment. I'm coming to UNCLOS, and it's very good to see that from this 1982 convention, they say that the problems of ocean space are closely interrelated and need to be considered as a whole. This shows already the holistic approach to this constitution of the sea. And in the preamble it says, recognizing desirability of establishing a legal order for the seas and oceans which will promote the equitable and efficient utilization of their resources. That's the use aspect, and at the same time the conservation of their living resources and the study, protection and preservation of the marine environment. So for the 1980s, this was already comparatively forwarded thinking. When you come to UNCLOS, it's very important to keep the maritime zones in mind. You have a zoning of the territorial sea up to 12 nautical miles. Then you have the exclusive economic zone, the continental shelf, maximum 200 nautical miles measured here from the baseline, and beyond that the high seas. So this is like the legal categories, and at the same time you have something I would call the geological categories. You have the continental shelf, the continental slope. So you have then the continental shelf and the water upon them, which is then the exclusive economic zone. So the continental shelf is the natural prolongation of the state territory. And that means that now we have a problem. I can see it here, but not on the screen. So it's very important to distinguish that the continental shelf itself is the natural prolongation, and that's why you do not need an specific legal declaration of your continental shelf, because you have it already as the natural prolongation of your state territory. In contrast, the exclusive economic zone, the water body upon the continental shelf, must be designated by the states, and they have done it in some areas, and in the Baltic Sea you have a clear economic zone declared. So with these zones there are certain rights and obligations combined. When you look at the rights, in the exclusive economic zone there's a sovereign right to explore, exploit the resources, and in the continental shelf it says there you have the right to use the sea bottom, for instance, for sand and gravel extraction, for oil and gas extraction. So you have specific rights in these zones, although it is not part of your national territory. Okay. When you look at the different zones, internal waters, landwards of the baseline, the territorial sea, 12 nautical miles seawards of the baseline and the exclusive economic zone, maximum 200 nautical miles seawards of the baseline, then you have different legal powers. And you find this presentation as a printout on the table over there. It's very important that you distinguish zone by zone what are the different rights of a coastal state. Okay. The internal waters is like the state territory. It is state territory. So you have a full jurisdiction. Whatever a coastal state wants to do, it's based on the sovereignty of the coastal state. And if you look at the territorial sea, it is as well part of the national territory. So there is as well a full jurisdiction. But things look completely different in the exclusive economic zone because it's not part of the national territory, but a coastal state may, according to UNCLOS, designate this area for own purposes. How exclusive economic zones are delimited is very interesting. You have a concept of equidistance. If you look at the Baltic Sea, it's of course impossible when you look between Germany, Sweden, Poland, and Denmark that everybody has 200 nautical miles exclusive economic zone. That's simply impossible. I think Denmark and Germany, they have an exclusive economic zone between the two countries of 3 kilometers each. Yeah? This is a fair sharing, but more is of course not possible if you look at the small distance in the Baltic Sea. As I said, in the EEZ you have sovereign rights for the purpose of exploring, exploiting, but as well for conserving and managing resources, especially energy. So already 1982, energy was mentioned, wind, wave, etc. and you have, as a coastal state, after having declared EEZ, a jurisdiction on artificial islands installations, such as wind farms, oil and gas platforms. You have the jurisdiction on scientific research and the duty of environmental protection. When I
What you cannot do, you cannot regulate shipping.
Yeah, I come to that. That's very good. That means when you look at maritime spatial planning, it is a new concept, but just as a general remark, whenever, in the case of internal waters, this is part of your national territory, then you of course have complete MSP jurisdiction, like on land, etc. It's a bit different when you look at the territorial sea, because here UNCLOS applies. And UNCLOS says that all the rights, the full jurisdiction of a coastal state is limited by the right of innocent passage of foreign ships. That's a freedom of shipping. And now the question is, do you have some hints for me? What do you understand by right of innocent passage? Please, not the people from maritime offices. This is too easy for you. Some ideas. What do you understand? I mean, yeah, Eva.
I mean, you are asking for a kind of definition of it.
Well, exactly. Yeah, innocent passage. Yeah.
May I use the
Of course.
because if you don't use any threat or use of force, and exercise or practice with weapons or an act aimed at collecting information to the benefit of the defense. And there are many other examples of what this means. But generally, if it is not a warship or if this ship doesn't have any intent to be prejudice to the territorial state, it can have the right to the innocent passage.
Exactly. Imagine, very good. Imagine if we would not have the right of innocent passage for other ships. That means you always have to take a deviation around the territorial sea. You know, that's simply impossible. So this is in UNCLOS, in the constitution of the sea, to simply acknowledge the importance of shipping as a transnational activity. And there is the right of innocent passage, and you can give positive examples. It must not be contrary, peace, good order, and against the security of the coastal state. As long this is realized, it is innocent passage, and every ship may use the territorial sea. Okay, in the EEZ, it's very different because this is not part of the national territory. We have so-called freedoms, and I come to that. Next slide. Third states have freedoms for certain activities in the exclusive economic zone. You can simply say that all the freedoms guaranteed on the high seas are applicable as well under the conditions of UNCLOS in the exclusive economic zone. So it's very important then to see that maritime spatial planning cannot deal with all issues. So it's functionally limited, and it's just dealing with all the issues the coastal state has a positive right, either as a sovereign right or in the meaning of jurisdiction. And then maritime spatial planning, we come to that I think later in the course, it's nothing more or less than coordinating all the rights conferred to a coastal state, and maritime spatial planning is organizing all these activities, so it's a voluntary self-restraint how to deal with all these maritime activities. Here I'm showing you in the upper area the rights of the coastal states, but now it's very important that UNCLOS always speaks about the rights of other states. In the territorial sea, we mentioned already the right of innocent passage, and in the exclusive economic zone, all states, coastal states or even landlocked states, doesn't matter, they enjoy the freedom of navigation and overflight, the laying of submarine cables and pipelines, and this is coming from Article 58. dealing with EEZ, together with Article 87 dealing with the high seas regime. But please keep in mind, when exercising their rights in the EEZ, states, that means other states, not the coastal states, other states shall have due regard to the rights of the coastal state and shall comply with the laws adopted by the coastal state in accordance with UNCLOS. So you see already you have freedoms, but you must use it with a certain prudence. Okay, when the coastal state, the other way around, when the coastal state is exercising its rights in the EEZ, the coastal state shall have due regard to the rights of other states and shall act in a manner compatible with UNCLOS. So you see there are rights and duties of the coastal state and third states, and in the end you need a mutual consideration, and I do think that maritime spatial planning can help in this legal mutual consideration. So, coming to the end, I think it's important to reiterate the most important activities on the sea. Let's stick for a second on shipping. And in the EEZ, as I said, all states have the freedom of navigation, but the coastal state can, of course, exercise exclusive rights and jurisdictions, for instance, by establishing artificial islands, installations, such as offshore wind farms. And whenever there's an offshore wind farm, there's obviously not enough space for a ship, or it's really recommended for a ship not to cross or collide with an offshore wind farm. But we have the competence of IMO to designate sea lanes for international navigation. And another example for the mutual consideration is that according to Article 60, Para 7, artificial islands, installations and structures and the safety zones around them may not be established where interference may be caused to the use of recognized sea lanes essential to international navigation. That means in the EEZ, a coastal state can designate an area to an offshore wind farm, but not in an international shipping lane. That would be contradictory to IMO rules. Okay, maybe it is a good idea to stop here. I brought some other examples concerning fishery. Jacek would like to have something on cables. Do I have something on cables? I have. Laying of pipelines and cables in the territorial sea. The coastal state may give full rule on pipelines and cables based upon the sovereignty. In the EEZ and continental shelf, there is a freedom of laying of pipelines and cables for all states as a transfer through the continental shelf in the EEZ, but the delineation of the course is subject to the consent of the coastal state. When you are transfer continental shelf and EEZ, but the laying itself may not be prevented. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much, and if you have questions, please come later. Okay, thanks a lot.
Hello.
Great. So I would like to introduce to you Heitze Siemers, one of the key leaders in EU pushing maritime spatial planning, and he's very brave, extremely brave, because maritime spatial planning is usually in the jurisdiction of the national states, and they came up with very, very important ideas that also at EU level something should be coordinated. And therefore, I would like to ask Heitze to share with us those ideas. Heitze, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And good morning to all of you. It feels extremely bizarre here sitting in front of this computer, because what you cannot see is that in front of me, I have about 15 rows of empty seats because I'm sitting in one of our big meeting rooms. So it's as if I'm talking to a row of empty chairs. But anyway, I'll try to make it as lively as possible. So as Jacek already said, one of the things that is really very important for us to achieve in the European Union is to get some form of a coherent approach to what we call maritime spatial planning. And we are not looking at that much at it as something which is an issue of competences or of something where the EU itself needs to interfere in the planning itself, but we see it more as something where we can play an added value role, if you will, in terms of simply strengthening how this work is done by the individual member states. So perhaps it's interesting to just start from our starting assumptions, if you will. And there's basically two of those. One of them is, and that's the initial idea, what brought the European Commission actually to come up with a proposal for integrated maritime policy in back in 2007, is the idea that we have huge responsibilities with regard to the seas around us. And at the same time, we're also beginning to use them more and more. And there are a lot of reasons why it's then important to make sure that whatever it is that we do policy-wise with regard to the seas is also properly interlinked. And in that context, one of the things that came up already at that stage was that maritime spatial planning is one of those instruments that makes it easy and makes it necessary to make sure that there are links between the various areas that work together at the seas, and that whether that's policy areas or operators, economic operators, is actually it's kind of the same type of angle. So that's one, which is this whole issue of how do you organize the way in which you manage seas and oceans. The other point that's equally important is that we are now in a time where our economy is perhaps not moving as quickly as it could. Although in the Baltic Sea area, the situation is somewhat better than in other areas around the European Union. And that therefore it's quite important to see how does the maritime economy actually work in that whole picture, and how can we strengthen the maritime economy whilst at the same time making sure that whatever it is that we do is also sustainable. And in that context, again, a lot of the activities that are being developed now in the maritime context are initiatives that move from an economy that is primarily taking place on the shore towards an economy that's taking more and more space offshore. And that again points to this need to make sure that whatever it is that we do then offshore is properly managed and properly coordinated. So that's basically the idea from which we're starting. Now, we didn't simply say, okay, we think that this is a good idea and therefore let's go for a proposal for a directive, but we did a very careful analysis of what maritime spatial planning actually means and what it entails. And that work was done in 2008 and 2009. We started out with a communication that basically described what maritime spatial planning is and what are the common denominators that you can find across maritime spatial planning initiatives that have been taken in the European Union in particular. And that was followed by a series of conferences that we had with stakeholders. And I think that everybody concluded that, first of all, these famous 10 principles that we looked at in 2008 were a very good idea in terms of how does maritime spatial planning look at European Union level, and what are the elements that are sufficiently clear as common denominators for them to be part of what we all should be doing or should be looking at. And that includes elements such as, for example, the fact that you need to set objectives for maritime spatial planning, that you need to make sure that you involve all the stakeholders, that there are important elements with respect to data and knowledge, that there needs to be an interconnection with what's being planned at sea and what is being organized on the land side, and that, of course, it needs to be a framework which is coordinated and which is stable, so that operators know what it is that they can do and need to be doing. That's the first thing. So that these elements that we have brought up were seen by stakeholders and experts alike as being useful elements and a good basis for continued work. And the other conclusion I think that a lot of people drew at that point in time is that it's really worth looking at some form of a common framework. And that, of course, is also hugely important because when you're looking at activities like maritime spatial planning in the context of the European Union, you're not looking at one member state doing it and maybe some others doing it as well. You're really trying to think whether it's not a good idea for all of them to be doing something, and then to make sure that all of that is connected, if you will. So that's the idea of a common framework. Well, I mean, basically what then happened is that we pushed our analysis even further. Our analysis and also the work that we did with stakeholders and regions in the European Union. One of the things that we did, for example, is that we said to ourselves, well, we claim that maritime spatial planning is something that's going to be beneficial to economic operators. Is that true? And we did a study on the economic benefits on maritime spatial planning in the European Union, which concluded that yes, if you have a stable framework and one which fulfills certain conditions in terms of stakeholder participation and other elements, then you can count on two things. One is the costs for operators who want to start working offshore are going to go down because they don't have to do that much research or they don't have to fight that many obstacles. And secondly, their preparedness to invest is going to go up because they will be faced with a situation which is much more transparent and much more predictable than was the case before. And in fact, one of the operators who appeared at one of these workshops that we did back in 2009 said precisely that. He said predictability, stability, and transparency, and that will make things a lot easier for us at sea. So all these are then the background elements that we continue to work on. And then the idea was, okay, if we want to pursue this, then obviously we should be looking at some action in this area. And we have to determine what it is that the European Commission can do most usefully in the context of maritime spatial planning in order to achieve the objectives that we're looking for. And on this, obviously, we did an impact assessment, and that impact assessment, I think, is probably known to most of you. It is online, obviously, because it was posted online at the same time as the proposal for a directive was adopted. And that impact assessment consisted basically at looking at what are our options here. Can we go for something which is an informal instrument that supports action and recommends action? Do we go for something that's a little bit more constraining in the sense that it tells member states within these limits, we think you should be acting, and there is a bit of a constraint and a bit of pressure to do this? Or do we go for something super prescriptive? And there's a lot of thinking that went into that. You know what the outcome was, which is that we chose the middle way. We said if we go for something which is purely voluntary and just a support mechanism, sure, it's going to have all sorts of nice little benefits, but it's going to have one significant drawback, which is that you cannot guarantee any success. You cannot guarantee that things are going to happen. You cannot guarantee that they will happen soon. And you cannot guarantee that there will be some form of coherence between what is being done within the various sea basins. So we basically went for that option, but of course there was a lot of discussion, and I'm sure all of you are aware of what's going on now in terms of the discussions we're having with member states and that have started now also in the context of the Parliament with respect to what does this mean in terms of member states' competence, as Jacek said initially, and what does this mean in terms of subsidiarity. And we looked at that extremely carefully because, believe it or not, our idea is not that everything should be centrally managed at European Union level. We really don't think so. There's far more things that can be done far better at the local, regional, and national level, and there's no reason for this kind of management to be done by the European Union. So what we try to do is to say, well, there's two things we want here. One is we want a framework which makes it reasonably clear that something is going to happen within a measurable time frame, which allows us to say we have basically coverage of our European sea basins by member states through systems of maritime spatial planning. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to start prescribing what that maritime spatial planning should do in terms of its content. The only thing we want to say is there are certain minimum requirements. If you say you're doing maritime spatial planning, you should be doing at least A, B, C, and E. And that's essentially the proposal that we came out with the feeling that in terms of subsidiarity, what this does is it allows member states themselves to determine how they want to organize themselves and what it is that they want to do in terms of content. and to make the system as sophisticated as they want to make it. And they only have to then satisfy certain minimum criteria in terms of, for example, public participation or cooperation with their neighbors, or the setting of objectives in a more general sense, but not something where for the rest there would be any European Union level interference. And then we looked very, very carefully also at the competence issue. There's a lot of discussion that's gone into that, and there's a lot of discussion for the moment, for example, about the whole linkage to what's happening in terms of planning on land. And there, I think, first of all, for us, it's very clear that there is definitely scope for the European Union to do things with regard to spatial planning. But as soon as you touch things like town and country planning on land, you have certain decision-making processes which are quite tough. With regard to spatial planning at sea, there is not really anything precise that has been set out, and we think that it would be useful to set that out in order to simply have a coherent system in place. So that's the competence angle, where again we looked at what is it that the European Union can do and should be doing, and what is it that should be left to member states. And for us, it's extremely clear that everything that is related to town and country planning and land planning is something that the member states want to do themselves and should be doing themselves. And for maritime spatial planning at sea, that the only thing that is important to have is some kind of a framework within which this can take place, and that member states themselves then decide how they want to fill that framework in terms of the concrete content. Voila, so that's where we come from. Now, there are two connected things, I think, which are important to realize here, which is one, that, as I mentioned earlier, it's important to have a connection with what's happening at the coast and what's happening on land. And that's why we have a coastal management component in our proposal as well. We work very closely with DG Environment, who are in charge of this topic, as you know, which is called Integrated Coastal Zone Management, to make sure that what we propose there is again something that is fully in line with competence issues and with subsidiarity. That's one. And the other one is that, of course, the whole thing doesn't operate in a vacuum. So you're all aware of what's going on in the context of Helcom BASAP with respect to maritime spatial planning in the Baltic Sea area. Very ambitious work, very good work, so we're very happy with that. And obviously there are a number of other member states, not all in the Baltic, but in the North Sea, for example, but also further south, who have established either a complete system for maritime spatial planning or at least the first steps towards it. So the challenge that we had in that context was then to make sure that our proposal allows member states who have already worked on maritime spatial planning and who have systems in place to be able to use those to the greatest extent possible. And that's a very significant part of the proposal that's on the table and that's being discussed for the moment. And one of the things that we're trying to do for the moment is that we're trying to make absolutely sure that this is as light as possible with regard to those who already have the system in place. And then again, as light as possible for those who are in the process of setting these systems up. Okay, and then maybe conclude on one last thing, which I think is very important for a number of member states, and that is that, of course, every system that you have to put in place, if you don't already have it, will require resources. And there's two things that I can say on that. One is we did, as much as possible, an analysis of the resources required to put in place maritime spatial planning systems. And one of the things that we noticed is that you can go for basically we had two extremes in our analysis, if you will. One is the system of some member states who have said, okay, we'll go for the gold-plated option. We will set up a whole new agency for this management purpose. We will give it staff, and we will make it work in extremely precise and detailed fashion on developing plans for all of our sea areas, and to do this as intensively and detailed as possible. And the other extreme is another member state which is not too far away from you, which basically developed its maritime spatial plan for its exclusive economic zone with existing resources within an existing agency. And not to say that it costs nothing, but in terms of the resource picture, it's a much more limited and much more lean approach towards maritime spatial planning, of which, for the moment, I think nobody can say that it's less effective. So these options exist. That's in terms of where we were in our analysis, and we try to build that into the impact assessment as well, in terms of simply stating, how expensive or inexpensive is it, and how does it situate itself with regard to benefits. And the benefits, just to add that quickly, the benefits are largely higher than any cost you could imagine for the setting up of such a system. Second point on this is that obviously we're aware that this still means that for some member states this is not going to be altogether too easy to implement cost-wise. So we're also looking into how we can support financially the development of MSP systems within member states. There are certainly means available that are foreseen in the proposal for the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund. However, that Maritime and Fisheries Fund is still under negotiation for the moment, and we don't know at this time exactly when it's going to be adopted and it will be able to start working. And secondly, there are provisions with which some have already made pretty good experiences under the current financial framework within funds such as the ERDF, which allow also for putting in place maritime spatial planning systems or developing projects, for example, for cross-border. And one of the things that we are now in the process of doing is that we're elaborating exactly the extent to which this kind of these kind of funds can be used appropriately. Voila. I think that that's as much as I wanted to say right now, and
perfect timing
to have some questions and some discussions.
Okay, it's a perfect timing. Please, if you have some questions, I can share with you micro. But Heitze, I want to tell you that both Nico and our friends from the Swedish Swamps, they listened to your speech, so this comparison was just to the right audience. And now my first question is about how you see, from perspective of EU Commission, incorporation of the third countries like Russia into this, for example, Baltic system. Do you have some incentives? And please also prepare your question if you wish.
Well, listen, I mean, cooperation with third countries is really something that we've built it into the proposal for a directive, as you know. And we are also aware that this is something which is very much dependent also on the interest of that third country. So it's not something where we say this is something that absolutely needs to be done or is a make or break kind of initiative. The only thing that we think is that if you are working on a coherent approach towards managing sea areas within a sea basin, then it only makes sense that if you have third country neighbors, you at least try to see whether they are interested in discussing this work with you. That, I think, is our approach. And a lot of work in this area, I think, has already gone on in the Baltic Sea area. And then it's really a question for those who are most closely involved to see how far they can push that cooperation. This is something which, let's put it this way, it's always an added benefit when you have it. So that's the take that I would have on this for the moment.
Hello, this is Riku Varjopuro from the Finnish Environment Institute, and I have actually two questions. One is, can you say something about the timetable, timing of the directive, and how it's progressing? And another one is related to, like you mentioned, the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund, and it as a possible source for funding. Can you open up a bit more? What is the thoughts of the Commission on how that well, most of the funds for maritime policy they will be under direct management from the Commission. What are your thoughts of how you will organize that share? Thanks.
Okay. So first of all, with respect to the timetable for the directive itself, where we stand for the moment is that it's in very intensive discussions in what we call the Friends of the Presidency for Maritime Policy, which, as some of you will be aware, is basically the equivalent of a working party for maritime policy, except that, of course, under the current institutional setup, such a working party doesn't exist. So the format chosen is that the presidencies successively are kind enough to organize meetings of what we call the Friends of the Presidency for Maritime Policy, and that's the format in which we're discussing this. So very intensive discussions, which started basically as soon as the proposal was out, sometime in April this year. And what it has now started as well is to work in the European Parliament, where the three committees that are involved, which is the TRAN committee, Transport and Tourism, which is in the lead, and the Fisheries Committee and the Environment Committee. The Environment Committee, which has close cooperation with the TRAN committee on this issue, have all done their draft reports. Amendments have been sent to them. The deadline was something like 10 days ago or so. And my assumption is that there will be a finalization of the reports towards the mid of November somewhere. Now, all of this then, assuming that the work continues to progress, would put us in a position for discussions between the two institutions reasonably soon. But I mean, it's very early days yet to say exactly how that's going to pan out. One thing that plays into our calendar for the time being, of course, is that we're looking at the end of the mandate for the European Parliament as of April next year. And that then means that any proposal which is not finalized by that time would have to be picked up by the new session of Parliament, which gets voted in after that. That's the timetable for the time being. I think that's the best I can do on that. Now, with regard to the funding issue and the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund, we're talking about, in fact, we're talking about two things here. The Maritime and Fisheries Fund has a budget which is to be administered by the Commission under direct management. And in the past, what we've done for maritime spatial planning is that we have provided subsidies for projects, which we have always said we wanted to be with the involvement of authorities from the member states for the development of cross-border maritime spatial planning. And we have a number of those that were launched, and we have one for which we need to close the call for proposals now and award the project. And this is obviously something which we would like to see to continue under the EMFF with some more money, and then obviously more targeted also at providing real support towards those member state authorities that want to put in place systems. So that is one option. And then the other option, as I mentioned earlier, is the other funds, which are, of course, funds which are under shared management with the member states, and where then it would be for member states themselves also to determine, we have intentions in the context of maritime spatial planning, and we would like to use this and this and this funding in order to develop this. And that's an option which also exists, and which we intend to elaborate on a little bit further also with our colleagues from the relevant services who are in charge of these funds.
Yeah, hello. My name is Mara Kozulina, and I'm representing here the Ministry of Environment and Regional Development of Latvia. And I've been following this proposal of Commission recently, and from what we see, there's huge divide of opinions between the member states whether or not this proposal is useful. And of course, there are regions in Europe with different experience in maritime spatial planning. I think the overall picture at the moment is the countries around the Baltic Sea think that the current policy instruments are sufficient. Perhaps Southern European countries, they would support this. So the discussion is quite going at the moment. And how do you see if there's ever a reconciliation between the countries possible, and how the Commission, what's the role of the Commission in this? And the second question would be on the initial proposal that came from the Commission was very detailed in objectives that the countries have to include in their maritime spatial plan, and that caused the discussion that actually European Union is setting the plan itself, that what countries have to include in their spatial planning. Maybe some short commentary from you on this. Thank you.
Okay. So in terms of how this proposal is faring, I don't think that we have unbridgeable differences between the member states. What I think is that there is I would call it, there is a huge hype about this whole issue of competences and subsidiarity, which is a completely overblown discussion for all sorts of reasons. And what needs to happen now is that we need to get to a point where in the discussions that we're having with the member states, we get down to what the concrete implications are, where I think everybody realizes that they are the only objective that this proposal sets itself is that member states do maritime spatial planning. That's basically what it boils down to, and that they work together across borders, nothing more. So that is part of the discussion. And of course, in negotiations, everything is, you have some opinions which are pushing in one direction, other opinions which are pushing in another direction, and at some point you'll have to find a way to reconcile them. And I think we're in a fairly good situation with the work that's going on the Lithuanian presidency for the moment to get to that point. So they are not unbridgeable differences at all, but everybody needs to, of course, find their points reflected and has to make sure that their concerns are addressed. The other thing is the question with regard to objectives, and this again is something where I can really highlight that this is an issue where I think there is a real misunderstanding as to what objectives mean in the context of this proposal, because the reason why this proposal is built the way it is because maritime spatial planning, which is a part of Europe's integrated maritime policy, is really a cross-cutting issue. So it serves all sorts of purposes. It serves the environment, it serves maritime transport, it serves fisheries, it serves energy, and it serves, for example, things like the development of tourism. So if you build a legal framework on the basis of this kind of a cross-cutting approach, what you need to do is you need to tell the legislators, which is the Parliament and the Council, what are actually the objectives that are being pursued by this instrument and that are being supported by this instrument. That is why we had and still have in our proposal these fairly detailed descriptions of the 5 objectives that are listed there. This has nothing to do with saying this has to be in every member state's maritime spatial plan. The only thing that this says is, it says these are the objectives that are the European Union objectives, by the way, agreed by all member states, because those are in the treaty, they're nowhere else, they're in the treaty. These are the objectives that are specifically being supported by this proposal. That's what this says. It doesn't tell member states that they now have to have maritime spatial plans which have only 5 subjects in them and they can't do anything else, or that those 5 subjects come first and everything else comes second. This is not what it means, and we're still discussing this very intensively with member states in order to get that straightened out. But again, the important thing for us is not to say we want member states themselves to look at this much energy in their maritime spatial plans and this much fisheries in their maritime spatial plans. No, we want just to make sure that there is a framework for maritime spatial planning in all the sea basins around the European Union. And then last thing, I think this comment about the fact that some think that the existing structures are sufficient and others think that they're not. I think it's much more differentiated than structures within member states. But you do not have any kind of coherence with respect to, for example, cross-border cooperation on maritime spatial planning in any sea basin. You have embryonic work that's going on, you have a discussion that's going on, but you don't have systematic systems for this type of approach going on. The thing that you also don't have is you don't have really anything that gives people a perspective on what will this look like and when is it actually going to be happening. And those are, I mean, even for those who are already far advanced in maritime spatial planning, those are the elements where there is still an added value at European level, in addition to the added value that is there for those member states who don't even have maritime spatial planning systems in place or only very partial ones.
Thank you, Haize. It was a great pleasure to have you also only virtually here. So thank you to you. And I hope your speech will bring some fruits here in the Baltic Sea region. Thank you once more. And we will report you unofficially about the outcome of the course. Thank you very much, because it's very important that we can have 3 levels. Global level given by Nico, EU level by you, and now it will be Baltic level given by Andrzej Cieślak. Thank you very much.
Thank you, bye.
Bye. Okay, Andrzej, so now you are welcome to show the Baltic level of, I would say, soft law, which means our cooperation at the Baltic level, the outcomes, the main results we have achieved. If you can squeeze, Andrzej, I know that it's almost impossible for you, but try to be condensed. So then I will give 5 minutes more to Nico to somehow market our beautiful vision. Yeah, but it would be great, because this is our joint achievement. Okay, so Andrzej, the floor is yours.
Okay. Oh, wonderful, it works. Well, I'll try to squeeze as much as possible. Just one remark on what Nico has been saying. Personally, I think that if one country is to do its maritime planning properly, then of course its neighbors also should do it. At least should have structures. Otherwise, in the sea, because it's interconnected, it's impossible to work alone. But secondly, what the directive doesn't do, at least enough, is that it doesn't set up a need to produce a kind of at least sea basin instrument. But, well, maybe they will work on it later on. Okay. The Helcom-Vaasa principles, just a short introduction. Well, there's been an agreement between the 2 organizations. Helcom, you know all about. VASAP is the organization of or agreement of ministers responsible for spatial planning in the Baltic. On common work, because both institutions, both organizations, have been promoting MSP. I would say VASAP first, then came in Helcom, but they said together we could have some force. So they set up this Helcom-VASAP Maritime Spatial Working Group. And it was supposed to facilitate the development of MSP in the Baltic Sea, and make the Baltic Sea a forerunner in MSP in Europe. Very ambitious. Well, you'll have this presentation anyway later on, so it's. I left it here because you would see what's behind this setting up of this cooperation. And we come, and one of the outputs, the first one, of this Helcom-VASAP working group was to develop these 10 principles, I would say Baltic Sea principles on broad-scale MSP. They are very much like the broad-scale MSP principles that have been developed by the Commission. And in fact, these developed by the Commission principles in turn are very much as alike as the ideas developed much earlier by a project called Baltiplan. Nico was one of the people in that project. I was happy to be there too. And that was the first ever project on EU or any other kind of level that really started to consider sea use planning, as we called it then, which turned out to be MSP. Now going into detail into these principles. The first one, there was a big discussion within the work group, which of the principles, this one or that one, should be the first. And this is finally we arrived that it should be sustainable development, sustainable management or sustainable development, which because if we talk about sustainable development, it's about you develop in the interests of people. It's for the people and for the various uses of the sea. Of course, these uses, to be sustainable, have to take care of the environment as an important resource which we use. But the resource has a lot of various very important things which the economic and the social elements are very important, and they are this is why in the wording that because this is a citation of what was written by us in this work group, that balancing between economic, environmental and social and other interests, we placed it in alphabetic order just to stress that it's equally important, all three. Now the ecosystem approach, the other principles says in fact that we have to take care of the whole ecosystem of the Baltic Sea as a whole, so we have to have a pan-Baltic perspective. And also, if we can separate sea basins inside parts of the sea as separate basins, we have to take the ecosystems of each of these basins as a very important element to be taken care of, and at the same time this sets up a kind of grid for the planning. One of the elements of the grid. The sustainable development thing also sets up certain elements of the grid. The uses, the most important pan-Baltic, for instance, uses transport, maybe wind farm setup, maybe other things. A long-term perspective and objectives, which means, well, as usual, spatial planning is about the future. But if we place something in this space, then it's there for centuries. Well, on land we have this example. English roads, quite a lot of important English roads, go along the routes that the Romans have along the route of the roads. And so on and so on. If we build a wind farm, it won't disappear in just even 50 years. It will stay there quite longer. It's crazy to think that we would remove the wind farms. I mean, who would in Norway want to destroy their dams which produce energy now, in fact, for free after this part of the time? So think about the long term, and always it has to be really long. Then there's one thing in the commentary: the establishment of a legal basis for MSP should be investigated, and that there should be an assurance of efficient implementation of maritime spatial plans and space allocation, which should be these simply that where one thing is to produce a spatial plan, but also the implementation phase, or even the things which are there before the spatial plans start to exist. And in some countries this will take a lot of time. So the systems should be also established now. Not all countries, even in the Baltic, have an integrated space allocation system at this moment even. Now the precautionary principle, of course, that's very well well known with respect to environmental issues. But it's also important that this should be also, this forward-looking perspective should be applied with respect to the economic and social dimension of all these decisions. Because when we talk about precautionary, when we talk about spatial planning, even you here have been speaking all the time about environment, ecosystem, lovely beaches and things. What about the people which are living around the sea and their ways of earning money? Well, it's of course absolutely visible that participation is important. The thing is that participation normally it's or very often it's like that somebody produces something and then only after he has produced it starts to discuss what he has produced. Now what is said here is that even at the start of the production process, already the participation and the transparency should be switched on, I would say. Next one, high quality data and information bases. In fact, this is something that everybody loves to talk about, and nothing's happening, because it's a very difficult issue on one hand, and then because everybody wants to talk about data. While if we think properly, and this is what we tried to, well, not quite, it didn't happen up to the end, but please, what the planner needs is not data, it's information given in a proper, understandable way, understandable to the planner who is not so very conversant in very detailed things about, I don't know, genes, or well, wave currents or anything, but understandable to him and also to the general public, which has to discuss these plans and the reasons for which some solutions have been made. So maybe when we turn to talks about information, maybe we'll come to some sensible solutions. At this moment, there's an ongoing discussion about databases, which is really useless, in my opinion, of course. Now, the sea has, in terms of influences, also activities, many activities has really no limits. There's a clear, I'm doing this, gosh. It has no limits. So it's impossible, at least with some things, to plan without coordinating and consulting transnationally. For instance, shipping lanes. For instance, a proper arrangement of conservation, or in fact Natura 2000 sites on the Baltic Sea have been proposed by each country separately. It doesn't mean that they really form a coherent system. They should, if they would be really effective. Now this is also a question, what is connectivity between, how do you achieve connectivity in the sea? A lot of questions which have not been solved on the, I would say, environmental side. But there's also some other things. If we place some uses like wind farms, how the whole system, also the ecosystem of the Baltic Sea would change. What will happen if, to various parts of the Baltic, if we start to have maricultures, algae, mussels and things in various places, changing the local ecosystem, but then this would influence the ecosystem as such of the whole Baltic, and this means then this whole, for instance, mariculture thing is also about quite new ways of living, earning money for the people, for the coastal people. Among others, we know that fishery on the Baltic will have to be reduced still more. What's going to come in place of that? And what kind of food production is there? This is all in this type theme, among others. Now the terrestrial, gosh, I don't know what to do with my hands. Terrestrial and maritime spatial planning, of course, if we, for even such a simple thing, building a wind farm on the sea means that we have to have a support area on land. So some users on the sea require a connection on land and appropriate planning. On the other hand, some kinds of needs, environmental needs also in the sea require appropriate behavior, also in terms of space on the land. Or for instance, coastal protection, and which means safety, very important issue. There has to be a way, it must be ensured that the spatial planning on land should influence spatial planning on sea, and on the other hand, the other way around too. Spatial planning or spatial needs on sea will and do influence the what's being done on land. And there has to be a mechanism, also a formal legislative mechanism to assure that. Well, special conditions and characteristics in different areas, the sea basin or parts of basins areas, and of course there has to be some kind of thinking about the specificity of, for instance, there's a different specificity of the Bothnian Sea and the Baltic proper, but on the other hand there's also some connection between them, and both have to be taken into account. And finally, continuous planning, which in general means that planning is not a one-off exercise. It has to be monitored, analyzed, synthesized, repeated, and improved constantly. Among others also, which is not written here, but because, well, this is a very new thing. So even because we learn more about what it's all about and how to do it, it has to be revisited, well, constantly. And that would be it. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. I would like to invite now Nico to present the vision, and then we'll have short time for questions to both presenters.
Okay, I have some minutes to introduce to you the Baltic Sea Plan Vision 2030. Baltic Sea Plan was an Interreg 4B project, and you find much more information on the webpage balticseaplan.eu and more than 30 scientific reports. But here now some words on the Baltic Sea Plan Vision 2030. This morning you told us already, what does the Baltic Sea mean to you? For a lot of people, it means a free horizon and an undisturbed view. but let's be honest, what can be the future of the Baltic Sea? And here you see some impressions from the WWF Baltic Plan comic on maritime spatial planning, and you see a lot of potential conflicts and future scenarios, what could happen to the Baltic Sea. So we need a clear vision for the years to come. Where do we want to see the Baltic Sea in 2030, and how can we achieve the future we would like to have? So the Spatial Vision 2030 is recognizing that the Baltic Sea is a unique, vulnerable environment. At the same time, it's an economic space, a transport space, an energy space, and in the end, from the perspective of a spatial planner, the sea space is a very valuable asset. And that's why the vision takes an integrated perspective of the sea users and the ecosystem. One of the few key principles which have been identified for allocating Baltic Sea space, it's the pan-Baltic thinking. In the end, it means that the Baltic Sea is one planning space and one ecosystem, although of course we have different administrative borders, but the ecosystem do not care about administrative borders. So we have to think Baltic and act regional. And one issue mentioned already before is the transnational connectivity. The transnational topics which are relevant for the whole Baltic Sea is the healthy marine environment, a coherent pan-Baltic energy policy, its safe and efficient maritime transport, and sustainable fisheries and aquaculture. And why are these topics so important from a bird's eye perspective on the whole Baltic Sea? All or nearly all Baltic Sea states are affected by developments concerning these four key topics. We have for some of them international targets. If you look, for instance, energy policy, there's an EU directive on renewable energy prescribing national renewable energy quota country per country. We have international targets and agreements, for instance, on safe maritime transport, and we have international agreements on sustainable fisheries. We all know that decisions taken by agencies, for instance on pipelines or on offshore wind farms, can have impacts on in a cross-border context, and all these impacts of siting decisions can go beyond national boundaries, and that's emphasizing that there's a big need for cooperation between Baltic Sea states necessary to achieve these topics. So this is in very short a glance at the vision. The vision is dealing as well with much more preconditions for an intelligent, prudent way of organizing the Baltic Sea and which state we would like to have in 2030. There is a whole chapter on cooperation on data management and monitoring the environment, and the vision is pointing out which structures in administrative terms are needed in order to work together cross-border and to come to a coherent maritime spatial planning throughout the whole Baltic Sea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nico. I must say that I had a huge problem for selection of the topics to be presented because there's much more, but we have only 1 hour and a half. So on top of that, Andrzej should say that we are producing now a roadmap for maritime spatial planning under the WASAP HELCOM group. This roadmap is printed there by Magda. You can take a look. We have no time to discuss it. This vision was endorsed by the WASAP, so it's an official document also produced by the project. Okay, so it has a political meaning. So now you can see this. As a maritime spatial planners, you must take into consideration a huge amount of different documents, starting from UNCLOS, then looking on Heizer-Siemers, ideas also not approved so far, so we'll see what will be the result. Then looking on all different conventions signed by your countries, and there is a numerous convention. ESPO is only one of them. On biological diversity, for example, Nico had a huge problem with flying bats, you know, to see whether the bats are flying over the sea, because there is a convention on that. And then you must look also on the soft law. And this soft law is what was produced by Vasap Helcom Group by this vision, okay? But at the end also, please count on your brains. Don't switch off your brains, because at the end, it's the ultimate resort you should use for maritime spatial planning. And now questions. So don't look only on UNCLOS. Also think when planning. Okay, questions to Nico, to Andrzej. Please.
It's a kind of reflection or maybe a question. I am just wondering about the necessity of integration, the spatial planning on the land and the spatial planning on the sea. Can we count with some general framework at European level, or is it a task of national regulations? I just wonder at what level should we discuss it?
Okay, very relevant question. Here is an expert at ICZM of you.
Well, that's simple. That's really just a plea from the Commission to integrate, or from the Helcom Vasap Group, or from any other international body, or the ICZM protocol, which is for the Mediterranean. But in general, the solution should come from national legislation. In the case of Poland, for instance, we have such a solution. And that's all spatial plans which concern the so-called coastal belt, it's designated very strictly, have to be agreed with the Maritime Administration, which in turn is responsible for producing maritime spatial plans. And on the other hand, the Polish Maritime Administration is obliged to agree to obtain agreement for its plans when they are developed, or when they are in the drafting stage, with local municipalities, with the coastal municipalities, which are responsible for the spatial planning on land. But still we want to improve, and also require that the regional plans should be, also the agreements should go between them.
And of course there are some other solutions. For example, in Finland, you are integrating it. How it is? Where is Finland? Finland, where is Finland? Yeah, here. But Estonia is the same. It's the same planning authority for sea and for land. So, and the Germany is the same, but it's not Nico.
No, I will not go too far in detail now, because I think we have later a little bit more discussion on that. But anyway, we have organizations or regional councils who are drafting actually these regional plans, which are covering land areas and sea areas as well. And but this does not include the EEZ. But actually, we did this voluntary, so it's possible. But let's say we would have a framework, existing framework, that we could now improve for MSP. So I think this is a very important point: how to benefit from existing patterns, just making existing things a little bit better. So I think there's a big challenge and opportunity.
This is a system of integration. They are twins, Estonia and Finland. And now you, Thomas, you are also integrating in Sweden. How you are doing it?
So hello everybody. I'm from the Swedish Agency of Marine and Water Management. I just arrived during the morning. So my name is Thomas. So sorry, what was your question? How we integrate? Well, in Sweden, the planning is actually done by the municipality so far, and they have the obligations to do it, and the mandate to do it for 12 nautical mile. But right now we are in the process of preparing for national planning, covering the EEZ zone as well.
Yeah, but to look on what is on the land when you are doing your plan.
Yeah, we yes and no. We're not planning for land, but we have to understand what's going on on land to connect somehow. But we're not doing the planning.
Yeah. But you You are trying to understand what is on the land. That's the third way. So the one way was, as Andrzej said, the other way was what is done in Estonia, and there is what they are doing in Sweden. They are trying to understand what it is. They are making very conscious inventory, and then they are putting it to the sea. Okay, Nico, you wanted to say something? No. Okay, more questions. One more question, because I know we have a lunch, but one more. Yeah, please.
Maybe it's not so much question again, but reflection and how to overcome this situation. You spoke about data and information. Of course, planners need information, but normally we don't have enough information. At least somebody saying that we don't know anything. And then we have a precautionary principle. If we don't know, we should not do anything. So this logic is saying that that normally the decision should be do nothing, because we don't know, we don't have information, and do not permit anything, because we don't know, and precautionary principle says that do not anything. And that's why the use of brain is important, but in real life it's very, very hard to do it, because somebody is against the project.
Great question. Great question. Who wants to answer? I have an answer, but Nico first.
Well, it is of course true that in the beginning you are afraid of not having enough information how to start. But if you then simply ask all the agencies, all the stakeholders who are working, living at the coast, and you tell them what you would like to do, then you will be surprised how many information you get as a feedback. And then it is the job of a spatial planner to coordinate the gaining of information and how to bring it in a setup. And there are so many institutes, agencies, private companies who have information and data. You simply, so to speak, bring them together in one room, show a lot of maps and ask the people which kind of information do they have for which part of the sea, and you will be amazed how much information you can collect. And then you have a good basis how to continue with your spatial planning process.
One more thing. Of course, especially on the sea, even on land, planning is an exercise with a lot of unknowns and always insufficient information, also on the sea, of course. But then, in fact, if you go out of the room, you have no certain information that something won't hit you. So you have to, of course, and this is an exercise in uncertainty, but this does not mean that precautionary principle doesn't say do nothing. It says don't do something that would result in a very disastrous effect. And this is the important answer, I would say.
In one project I will present you in Middlebank, what we did, we had no information. We thought, okay, it's a very nice place for windmills, but perhaps it's naturally valuable. So what we said, first check this, and then you can build windmills. That's a precautionary principle question.
Comment. I would like to continue where actually Nico was ending. So when I now have a few words about our practical planning. So we started our planning process, and people will ask us, you don't have any information, and we wanted to have information on about the sea geology and biology and about hotspots of geological diversity and biodiversity. And then in the first place, people say there is no data, but then we just went to the Finnish Environmental Institute and asked them, help us. And it showed up there's a lot of information, so many data, so we got everything we actually needed already now, even they're still going on researching. But it was the main thing to just ask the different organizations. There is data, you only have to very often ask, and you will get a lot of information. I think it's very often underestimated. That people just make the life too easy in saying we still have to do more research. If you ask a researcher, he will always say we have to do more research before we give you any information. But you have the information already. You just have to be brave enough and go forward.
Very dangerous discussion in Poland because Ania, she wants to start maritime spatial planning in Poland, and then she can think that there is no need of any money for that. It can be done for free because the information is so it's not so easy, of course, but you can use stakeholders wisely. Okay, so sorry, I must break now because Magda will kill me. We have lunch and we will, we should discuss whether we have lunch? No. We have a lunch and we'll come back here at 1 o'clock sharp. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. Yes.